The Hittite Warrior by Joanne Williamson, Chapter 17. The door was swung open. A man walked into the chamber, and I knew that he, and no other, could only be the great one of the city, and of all the hill cities of Canaan. All the room seemed smaller for his entrance, for he was a big, black-bearded man, the tallest and broadest-shouldered among them all. He had wide-set eyes, black as night, under thick, straight brows, and the nose of a hawk, a Hittite nose. Every curl in his rich beard was oiled, and it was held in place by a golden mesh studded with jewels. The rings on his hands, the gold collars and bands about his neck and arms dazzled the eyes. The sacred metal about his neck was carved lapis lazuli, and a single emerald from Egypt of great weight studded his right ear. All, except the high priest of Moloch, cringed and bent before him. "The great chair," called the chief elder. "Let the great chair be brought for the ruler of Harosheth." "There is no time," said the Lord Sisera. He sat himself down unceremoniously on the high bench, and the chief elder and the priest stood respectfully beside him. He sounded grim and angry. "Great things are happening. Even as you sit here, I have had news that the town of Bethshan has been raided by Hebrew tribesmen. Squads of soldiers have been attacked and slain by bands of shepherds. Never in 100 years have they dared such things. It has begun." A babble of voices began in the chamber, but was stilled when the ruler turned his blank, dark gaze upon the elders. I stood bewildered in my chains, thinking that I had been forgotten by everyone. But all the while my eyes were on the great one of Harosheth, and my heart was saying, "This man was my father's friend." "The council will hear the words of the great one without delay," said the chief elder shrilly. "Let the prisoner be taken back to the prison." "Wait," cried Sisera. And suddenly the black eyes were turned upon me. Their gaze struck me like a blow. "With what is the prisoner charged?" "He is guilty, my lord," said the priest of Moloch, "of the highest sacrilege among the gods." "Against the gods. He has cheated the Lord of Wrath in Tyre of his sacrifice." The black eyes widened a little, but they did not seem shocked. I even thought there was a gleam of admiration in them. "I do not know he is guilty," said the chief. "You, Uriah Tahund, are you guilty?" He knew my name. Perhaps the guard had gotten word to him after all. But I could not answer him, for by this time I was so confused and tired I did not know whether I was guilty or not. "There is more," said the priest of Moloch. "The young man is a traitor to all the gods of Canaan." And while my heart sank, he told the chief of Harosheth of their questions to me concerning the Hebrews, and my terrible answer. The great one stared at me steadily for a moment. There was no expression in his eyes except for a kind of calculating look, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Then he turned back to the elder of the priests. "The blasphemy," he said, "was committed in our sister city of Tyre. Would you steal her revenge from our sister? Is this the time to turn cities of the coast against us, when we of the hills have trouble in another quarter?" The priest of Moloch leaned toward him to protest, but the great one slapped his hand down upon his knee and spoke in a loud voice. "Let the prisoner be taken to the great house. All in Harosheth is mine. If he is the prisoner of Harosheth, he is my prisoner, and I will judge him. And if my judgment goes against him, I will send him back to Tyre. But," and he leaned toward the priest of Moloch, and to my amazement winked suddenly, "but I will send him back in such a manner that when he reaches the gates of our sister city, he will not be alive to tell the tale. And so Harosheth will, after all, have the honor of his death, and yet Tyre cannot accuse us." The chief elder nodded at this, looking pleased, but the priest of Moloch stood back, his eyes narrow and gleaming with anger. There was nothing, though, that he could say against the great one. And so, more dazed than ever, I was taken from the temple. My chains were struck off, for Sisera commanded it, and under guard they took me down the paved street of Harosheth to the many-colored great house of the chief. I had no time or heart to look about me. I only remember that once inside the great house, I was taken in charge by a tall, powerful man, and that when I looked at him, I gasped, for he was as black as ebony, like the black soldiers from Cush, who used to guard the Minas for pay in Crete before the great earthquake. This one seemed to be a kind of servant, but there was a look of danger in his eye, and when I was shut inside the room down a passage, I knew he guarded the door. There was a great bed in the room, greater and more richly carved and inlaid than any bed in the house of Edibal. I laid myself down upon it and felt nothing but softness, for I was too weary even to be afraid, and soon I slept. When I woke, it was dark, and someone had lighted a little oil lamp. Whoever it was had seated himself at the foot of the bed. I raised myself and looked into the shadows. It was Sisera. In the dim light, I could see that he no longer wore the splendid robe and ornaments of the great one of Harosheth, but was dressed in a simple tunic and might have been any powerful aging man, his black beard turning gray. "You have slept well," he said to me. "No, stay where you are. You have a right to rest." He rose and went over to the window, looking down upon the moonlit city. "The wind from the hills is cool tonight," he said. "It is a blessing. Canaan is hot after the winter." "Was it cold by the shepherds' fires?" I swallowed a little and nodded. "The nights were chilly," I said. "And you slept in the open, wrapped in your robe, and lived like a farmer." I know. Suddenly he turned toward me. "I know who you are. When the slave from the prison spoke the name of your father, it winded me for a moment, and before I thought, I rewarded him, instead of having him slain for bribing his way in to see me. Your father," he added softly and stopped. When I spoke, his eyes were glistening. "I have never seen great Hatti," he said, "but it is half my home, because my mother is a Hittite. Yes, she is the daughter of the Hittite governor who ruled in Harosheth before the days of the battle of Kadesh. See, here is my grandfather's ring." And he showed it to me on his strong, hairy black finger, a carnelian carved with the Hittite emblem of the double axe, just such a ring as my kinsman, the chief of Arzawa, had worn. My chest swelled with tears I could not shed. "Your father came to me in Carchemish," he said, "and saved me from a wild horse, like one of those Hittite heroes in my mother's stories. I loved him. I shall never forget him. The stories he told me about the land that was half my home, how the wind blew over the grasslands, how all the men were strong and all the women beautiful, how the horses roamed the steppes. Suddenly the tears I could not shed before overcame me, and I found myself crying into my arms, while Sisera watched me with strange, calculating look. "Cry if you like, Uriah Tarhund," he said. "There is no shame in shedding tears for a homeland you will never see again." "Someday," I sobbed. "No, you will never see the land of the Hittites again," said Sisera. "It is a land of strangers now. It is no more except in the hearts of its children and its standard, which is here in the great house of Harosheth. Will you turn against that standard, Uriah?" "No," I cried. Suddenly Sisera bent over me, and he was again the terrifying, godlike man he had been in the council chamber. "Tell me what you know of the Hebrews," he said harshly, and looking into his cold black eyes with the thought of the standard of great Hatti in my heart, I told him, 5 of their tribes have joined the rebellion. There is no danger from the coast tribes, for they will not join." "How many will this give them?" "Perhaps 10,000 men." "Where will they meet?" "On Mount Tabor, south of the Great Lake." "Who leads them?" "A man called Barak ben Abinoam of the tribe of Nephalti, near here." Sisera heaved a great sigh, and then he sat down and wiped his forehead. I lay back on my bed, numb and exhausted. "It is finished," I thought. "I have betrayed them." "All this is true," Sisera muttered at last. "How do you know that, my lord?" I mumbled, not caring whether he believed me or not. "Because I know it already," he replied. "A man from the plain near Kadesh came to me and told me, for a good price." "Heber the Kenite, I should have known before." "Then why," I cried, "did you make me tell?" "Because," said Sisera, "if you had not told, I would have sent you back to Tyre, dragging over the ground at the end of a rope, bound to a galloping horse. For though I loved your father, I love Harosheth and the gods more, and those who fight for them I must know to be on their side." I rose slowly to the great bed and drew my hand across my forehead in wonder. "Then now," I said, "I am free?" "I am your judge," said Sisera, "and I have found for you. But the priest of Moloch—" "Oh, the priest of Moloch will bow before me like all the rest," said Sisera harshly. "I am the great one here. Now get up." I obeyed him, as all must. "I have something to show you," he said. And I followed him down the great stone stairway and into the dark street of the city. The black man, who I learned later was Sisera's armor-bearer and charioteer, and his bodyguard against assassins, walked silently along with us, as did a servant bearing a torch. I drew the air of the fortress city deep into my chest. I should rejoice, I thought. I am free again. But I could not rejoice. I could feel nothing at all. As we walked, Sisera talked calmly of preparations for the fighting. "There is little time," he said, "to send for horses and chariots from Egypt. If they would send them, but I think they would not. Egypt has trouble of her own in these days. But there are still horses in the north, and chariots too, and our own workmen here in Canaan are becoming more skillful." "How many will there be?" I asked him, not really caring. "Enough," he replied. 20 horses for our troops are stabled here in Harosheth tonight, and that is where I am taking you." For the first time my heart stirred. There were few horses in Canaan, except those imported for battle. These Canaanites do not love horses. I have seen them shiver at the thought of them, as I have sometimes shivered at the thought of an Egyptian cat. But already my hands were aching for the feel of smooth skin over the moving muscles, for the touch of the soft muzzles in my palm. They took me to the stables near the city wall, with its roofs of palm leaves. I could smell the well-remembered stable odor and hear the familiar stable sounds of soft puffings and pawings. The servants held the torch aloft as I ranged over the open stalls, feasting my eyes on the handsome animals and whispering to them. Suddenly I stopped. In one of the stalls was a stallion, a little larger than the others, of a shining honey gold. His ears were longer too, and his ribs strong as a barrel, and he had a look of horses from the south. My heart beat faster. Where did he come from? I asked. He is not a northern horse, but neither is he a horse of the desert. Sisera said nothing, and I stepped closer. The animal whinnied in alarm, and then bent his head and laid his muzzle against my neck. And I knew. Labernash, I said, my colt, I raised him. I trained him, I gave him to the great one in the Hattusis, because he was the best I had to give. Look how he knows me. My arms were around the strong neck, my face buried in the short, coarse mane. The Canaanite servant looked a little sick, but the startling eyes of the black man gleamed. Where did they find you, you beauty, you darling? I cried. He was a favorite of the young lord of the great Hatti, Subululuma, said Sisera. He who would have been the second of that great name, had he not died with his father at the hands of the sea people. I found him by chance on a trip to Carchemish. He was in the stable of a young king armor-bearer who had escaped from Hattusis after it was destroyed. He told me who it was who had given the animal to the king, and it seemed as if it were assigned to me, so I brought him here. If you had answered me falsely, he would have dragged you to your death journey to Tyre. But now he will draw your chariot in a battle against the Hebrews. Chapter 18, the host of Canaan. In the days that followed, I saw little of Sisera. It was a time of quiet in Harosheth. The great men of the town conferred together, and the people gathered about the walls of the great house and the council chamber, hoping for scraps of news. Every day runners left the city with messages for other inland towns like Megiddo and Tanakh. The air about the city was often alight and smoky with fire signals. I was to serve in the host with the heavy chariots, but my training would not begin till we had marched out and the armies had gathered at their appointed meeting places. So, for the next few days, I was much alone. The mother of Sisera, with whom I would have liked to talk because she was a Hittite, was kept secluded with her maids behind her lattice windows in the manner of Hittite women. The servants were not as they had been in the house of Etebal, where they would gossip freely as the day was long. Here they seemed sullen and afraid, and I understood why. On the morning that one of them was taken into the huge courtyard and beheaded in the sight of all the rest, he had, I learned, broken a vase, of which the head wife of Sisera was fond. So all I had to talk with was Mehmet, the black man. He too seemed sad and sullen, but was not afraid. He had been sent as a boy, he told me, to Egypt from Cush to serve in an Egyptian guard, and then he had been sent by the ruler of Cush. But the rulers of that once great land of the blacks had for many years been nothing but slaves of Pharaoh, echoing his orders. Then his company had been sent to Canaan, where Sisera had seen him and, impressed by his great strength and savage look, had made him his bodyguard. Would you like to go home? I asked him. I would like to see the great city of Mem again, and the forests and the plains, and the prince in his ostrich-plumed crown, he shrugged. But it is not my home. For many hundreds of years my people have had no home. I thought of my father saying, it is not your home, it is their home now. To take my mind off that, I asked him, how is it that you are not afraid of the Great One, like all the rest? Memnet threw back his head and laughed for the first time since I had known him. It is not all the rest who are afraid of the Great One. It is he who is afraid of them. I did not understand this, and I did not like to think of the things that puzzled me. So I put what Memnet had said out of my mind. Labernash, I whispered to my beautiful horse on my daily visit to the stall, you and I will never understand this strange new world where everything changes from day to day, and nothing is what you think it is, and every minute you must make a choice. But you and I are together again, and that is enough. The day came when we were to ride out to the encampment and meet with the hosts of the other towns, and for the first time I saw my chariot. It was not mine alone, for it was a heavy Hittite car for 2 riders and a driver. This was the great weapon of the Hittites, perfected by them and once used in the conquest of half the world, even to the borders of Egypt. It was sheathed and shafted with bronze and had swift round wheels, made more deadly by the sharp, costly iron scythes that stood out from them. But suddenly, while I stood gloating upon it, I was shaken all over, because for one flashing moment I saw it as a terrible, murderous weapon for the crushing and tearing of Jotham. The moment passed quickly, for Labernash stood between the shafts. There were 3 horses, and he, the strongest and bravest, was the leader. I mounted into my car and stood proudly beside the man who was my chariot mate. The Harosheth troops were all around me. They were a handsome sight, tough and bearded, except for the young boys, dark brown from the sun and the wind. We were all assembled by the gates of the great house, waiting for Sisera to appear and take his place. He did not come for a while, and I knew where he was, in his mother's rooms, unable to tear himself away from her presence. For of all the people in the world, Sisera loved his Hittite mother best. When he finally appeared, cheer after cheer went up, and I thought that whatever the truth of Memnet's words, Sisera surely did not have to fear his soldiers. He mounted into his light chariot, shared only by Memnet, who stood straight and still as an ebony statue. For a moment nothing of either of them moved, except Sisera's black eyes, which swept us all with their expressionless gaze. Then the great one raised and lowered his arm in a swift gesture, and men began to march, and the chariots to roll. Many people were crowded into the main street of the city to watch us go out. Palm leaves were waved before us, and heads thrust through windows. We came to the city gates, and I closed my eyes against the sight of the place of execution, where such a short time ago I had expected to die beneath crushing stones. Even now, executed men were hanging heads downward from the walls. The sun streamed down upon me, and Labernash was in the traces before me. Still, I turned away my eyes. The encampment of the host of Canaan was not far from the city. Its dark tents rose ominously. All around the ground within their circle was kept neat and unlittered, as was pleasing to the gods. My chariot mate and I were to share a tent with 2 other young men. We were sent to our quarters and came face to face with them that first night. Both of them had been lying on their backs in silence, but they sat up when we came in to satisfy their curiosity and welcome us after a fashion. To my surprise, I saw that one of them was a Hittite, with his hair braided in the Hittite manner. From the north somewhere, I suppose, judging by his fair skin and his light-colored eyes. Harwan Waldulis of Sinuah, he introduced himself sourly. Sinuah was on the Black Sea of the north, and the Sinuans were a rough, suspicious lot, who kept to themselves with their fish. This one, said Harwandulus, pointing to the other young man, calls himself Amoses. He is an Egyptian. And then he spat. I stopped myself just in time for making a sign against evil. This was the first Egyptian soldier I had ever come upon in such close quarters, and I stared at him with great curiosity. He did not look evil, being very thin and rather frail. He had a dark face that I thought ugly, being thin and delicate, but with a heavy, stubborn jaw. There was something more about him, something strange. I kept thinking that I had seen his face before, though I knew it was not so. "Do you play hounds and jackals?" he asked me. I shook my head, still staring at him, and he sighed and lay back on the ground. Later, though, he brought out his checkerboard and offered to teach me the game. But I refused. I had been told too many stories of Egyptian soldiers when I was a child, and I could not forget them. Besides, I noted that he had brought with him no sacred medals or household images for prayer, as had all the rest of us. All he had was his hounds and jackals boards and an old copy of an ancient Egyptian classic, Senu the Stranger. I wished I could bring myself to ask to borrow it, for I had heard of it, and I often wanted to read it. I mentioned this outside the tent to Harawandulis. "You let them make you read?" sneered the Hittite boy. "I took you for a soldier, a man of high caste." My mouth fell open. "As for him," he jerked his thumb at Moses and raised his voice so that he would hear, "I spit when I see him. Nothing but evil ever came out of Egypt." He turned and he strode away from me, and I stared after him. His words sounded strange and ugly in my ears, and yet those were words I might have spoken myself a year ago. This was another puzzling thing that I put out of my mind. In the days that followed, the hours of training were long and strict. Our hosts were made up of all kinds of men. There were Amorites and Arameans from the deserts to the northeast, Hittite mercenaries in exile from their country, like Haruandulis and myself, Egyptians from the garrisons of Pharaoh and Canaan, some of them blacks from Cush like Memnet, and of course the Canaanite troops themselves from Harosheth, Megiddo, and Tanakh, and the great cities of midland Canaan. And all eyes were turned toward the great tent of Sisera. Sisera in those days had no desire to be alone. He would often invite one or another of his captains of 1,000 to dine with him. We would hear with envy the sound of well-played music and loud laughter coming out of his many-colored tent. I never dreamt of being allowed with those well-guarded precincts, so it was with great surprise that I looked up one night to see Memnet, stiff and magnificent, gleaming in his ornaments, and standing before me. "Uriah Tarhun, son of Arnadash, you are summoned by the captain of the hosts," he told me. "You are to take wine with him tonight in his tent." Harwandulis gave me a look of stunned amazement. Moses the Egyptian looked up from his book and said in a tomb-like voice, "Some people are highly favored in this world. Will you make me your armor-bearer when you return, my lord captain of 1,000? Read your book, I told him rudely. It's all you are fit for in the presence of a great man like myself. He rolled it up and threw it at me, and nearly regretted it, for it just missed the common dish, which had not been cleaned. We looked at each other, and I found we were both grinning. It came to me with a shock that I liked him, Egyptian or not. But where was it that I had seen him before? Then I followed Memnet, and a feeling of excitement came over me at the thought of entering the great tent of the captain of the hosts. It was more like a great house than a tent. Woven of many colors, it covered much ground and was divided into large quarters, some of it for Sisera's servants and entertainers. Inside it was furnished with costly rugs and the finest of carved inlaid furniture. The image of Dagon that had been brought from Gaza was there for Sisera to offer to, of polished ebony, with a head of lapis lazuli. And Sisera was there too, dressed as for a feast. But the tent was cleared of all except him and me and Memnet, who stood silently in a corner, and a girl musician who offered me a wine in a cup of polished bronze. Drink, Uriah Tarhun, said Sisera. There was a look in his eyes that I did not understand. Wondering, I obeyed him, draining the cup to the last drop. The girl took it from my hands and slipped away. Now, said Sisera, and his voice was strange, you and I together will pray to Teshub, the king of Hittite gods, most mighty of all. For you are a true Hittite, the son of my beloved friend, and surely he will bless us both. In the corner was the stone-cut image of Teshub as the bull, and it was to him that we went, not to the gleaming image of Dagon. Meat burned in the little altar before him, and we bowed ourselves to the ground before it. Sisera pressed his ring with the double axe to his lips, and we whispered the invocation, O thunder God, O my Lord, and nothing else was heard but the hissing of the meat on the little fire. And though I did not know it, that was the last time I was ever to offer my heart to Teshub, God of the northern forests of my ancestors, God of the double axe. When it was over, I looked at Sisera with all my questions in my eyes. As if I had spoken, he answered me, We move out in the morning. He said it in his calm, flat voice. Say nothing to anyone else. They will know when the sun comes up. My heart beat faster. The day was at hand. Soon I would know what a battle was. One more thing, said Sisera. If I should not come home to Harosheth, for who knows the will of the gods, you must go to my mother. Remember, she is a Hittite woman. He looked like a man who had seen an omen. And suddenly I knew what that look in his eyes was. It was the look of fear. But that cannot be, I told myself. It would not be half-armed, wandering tribes from the hills of Canaan who would have the glory of the death of Sisera. But Deborah and Barak and the Hebrew God came into my mind. And suddenly the thought came to me that even I might die. And what then? I did not like to think of the dark, sad underworld that the priests told of, Sheol, as it was called by the Canaanites. The mother of Etebal said that in Egypt they taught that the very good would live with the gods themselves, but the wicked would be condemned to the lake of eternal fire. Well, I told myself, I had never done anything very wicked. Besides, after that one moment, I knew I was not going to die. In the morning we were assembled into corps, with the squadrons of the chariots in the front ranks, flanked by the bowmen on foot. I whispered to Labernash, and I talked to the charioteer of how to handle him. There is no holding him, I said, but he understands the slightest touch of the reins. Remember, he belonged to the 4th Arwandawas and the 2nd Subliama of the great Hatti. The captain of the host had 2 dark horses from Egypt in the shafts of his light chariot. He was swathed in Tyrrhenian purple that I had always envied, till I had smelled the dye houses and heard of the blinded men who pulled the grindstones and did not last long in the work. The sun gleamed on his armor until suddenly a shadow came across it. It is raining, I said in surprise. It is too late for heavy rain, said our charioteer. It can't last long. My chariot mate had not yet arrived, and the charioteer told me he would not. At the last moment, he said, he had been transferred to another squadron and replaced by a new man. But why? I said. He and I have trained together. My charioteer, who knew everything before anyone else, said that this new man had come late. He was from another city, he said, and had offered himself to the host of his own free will, as an atonement for some sin or another. Because he was a man of rank, he must serve with the chariots. It is too bad, said the charioteer, because you are a skillful chariot man. So our captain of 100 is putting this green one with you. Here he is now. And I turned and saw standing before me a graceful young man with a handsome pale face and a mouth that looked as though it had never smiled since the beginning of time. It took me a moment to realize it was Hannibal ben Etebal.